I've discovered something shocking about Grey Zone Warfare's recoil system that completely turns the weapon meta on its head, and I'm actually really surprised that I haven't seen this mentioned, well, really anywhere. So what is this big discovery of mine? After the 0.3.5 patch, the current recoil system in this game is more akin to Counter-Strike than Escape from Tarkov. For many of you, the ramifications of this will be immediately obvious, but let me just spell it out. Every gun in Grey Zone has a set inbuilt recoil pattern that it follows every time you fire it on full auto. When I went back to check, it turns out the Grey Zone guys did actually put something out saying exactly this, but nobody has really talked about it. So there are two major implications here. Firstly, although you can increase or decrease the recoil pattern itself by using different mods, the intrinsic pattern that it follows is fundamentally attached to the weapon itself and is independent of any attachments that you use. Secondly, if you want a weapon that performs the best, quote unquote, the pattern is more important than the mods that you use, because some of the patterns are more controllable than others. So now that we're in game, we're going to be focusing on 556 because it's a bit easier to compare and contrast the differences between them. We're currently in a custom server. I'm just going to get rid of a load of these to give us some space so we can actually talk about the things we want to talk about. So we're going to sort this stuff out and pack it over here. We're going to build some various weapons down there. So we have all of the vendors open. As you can see, they're just loading in now. And what gives the individual weapons their actual profile for this spray pattern is the lower. So you can either just buy a gun like this, it's named M4 or it's named M16. That is what describes which recoil pattern these weapons are going to have. And if you're building these completely from scratch, then this is going to be determined by these parts here. These are the lowers, and these are the pieces that everything else connects to. So this determines the recoil spray pattern. So within 556, the fundamental ones that we have access to is CQA1, but this thing isn't full auto, so we're going to discount this for the time being. We have the DDM4, which is the one that people normally use as the meta endgame choice. You have the M16A1, which is new in this particular patch, and we have the M4A1. There is nothing particularly special about any of these individual weapons outside of the spray pattern. The DDM4 has very slightly more ergonomics, 8% versus the M4's 5% versus the M16's 4% to start with. But other than that, all of these lowers can take all of the same parts. So this means that it's very easy to compare the recoil between them. What I'm going to do, I'm actually not going to bother buying the DDM4 for the time being. I'll show you this, it's just going to be easier to get started and give a demonstration. So let's take off level 4 for the time being, and we will talk about level 4 at some point. This includes this new weapon here, which is also 556, this guy, the L43A1, which is pretty good, but this one doesn't share compatibility with these, so that's why we're excluding it for the moment, but I will show you a little bit later. So let's just buy this DDM4. I'm going to buy 3 of them. The first one we're going to use as a DDM4, as it is. Now, if you want to convert one of these to any one of the others, you basically just go into the inspect screen, you find the upper receiver, which is basically identical across all of them actually, except a little bit of durability difference, and you drop it onto the M16 lower. Then you take the buffer tube and drop that on, the pistol grip, drop that on, the charging handle, drop that on, and the magazine, put that on there. Same thing with the M4, I'm just going to take this upper, we'll just flip them over onto this other gun. So now these weapons are basically identical. I don't know why this one's coloured differently, but if you look at the statistics, outside of the little ergo difference that we saw previously, these things will all have exactly the same statistics. You can see 41 across the board, 12 across the board, and then a little different on ergonomics, 31, 30, and 34. The MOA is the same because they have the same barrel. The starting durability is 100, but the listed name of each individual weapon is different, and I will show you that right now. These are all loaded up with SP. The actual ammo doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And let's start with the DDM4. This is the classic best in slot. So we'll showcase this here. Now, I was looking at the shooting range previously for this, but it's actually better to do them on these doors because the decal for the shot is slightly smaller. So we're going to crouch just so the recoil doesn't go over above the top, and we're going to start shooting down here. We'll hold breath, and then we'll show you the same with the DDM4 versus the M4 to start with, and then we'll compare to the M16. So here we go with the DDM4, and I'm not going to move my mouse at all. This is just pure spray pattern, and this is repeatable and the same every time, as will become apparent. Alright, so there you have the DDM4. So it starts off straight for the first 3 bullets, veers to the right for the next 3. There's about 6 in a line, does a little jink back to the front, a lot of right hand, and then it goes left and back up to the top. Right, let's swap over to the M4. I'll show you the M16 last. Let's swap this guy over. Make sure we are on full auto, and we'll do the same again. So the M4, different spray pattern. It goes up further, and then it starts veering probably more consistently, I would say, than the DDM4, and it ends up further across to the right overall. So the overall displacement is not as good as the DDM4, which I think is the reason why people are normally saying that the M4 is slightly worse than the DDM4 when it comes to the recoil pattern. Because normally what people are worried about is horizontal recoil. You can always just pull down if it's pure vertical, whereas with horizontal, it's a little bit harder to adjust for it. So let's have a look at the M16. Again, remember that all of these guns have exactly the same statistics, so it doesn't actually make any difference which one we're using, other than this spray recoil pattern. And as you can see, the M4 and the DDM4 have exactly the same height as well, so they've all got the same base recoil in terms of lift. It's just the spray pattern itself that's different. Right, here we go, M16. Now, I will leave you to conclude this to yourself, but my impression of this is that the M16 is the superior weapon out of these three. The recoil is the same, basically, between all these three guns, and it purely depends on the parts that you put on it. So the vertical recoil is completely unaffected by the actual weapon name itself, but the horizontal recoil pattern on the M16 goes up like this. It's pretty much straight all the way up to here, then it veers off to the right a little bit, jinks a little bit back, and ends up there. So it ends up much closer in displacement to our starting point than any of the others. This was the M16, this was the DDM4, and this was the regular M4. So I think that the M16 is actually probably the meta weapon between these three because it has the best horizontal recoil. And as we said, everything else in recoil just comes down to the stats that you have on these, and they're all completely interchangeable. So it doesn't matter which weapon you're using. The compatibility is the same between all of these guns. Okay, so next up, what about the L40 then? Because this is the new best in slot weapon. It's very expensive. It comes with some really nice buffs right out of the gate. And yes, it's expensive to buy, more so than even the DDM4, but it's in 5.56, so we should go and test this. As I said before, the comparison with this one is a little bit more confusing than with the others because you can't just take up a receiver and slap it on. The parts aren't compatible because it's its own weapon. So what I've done, I actually have pre-recorded this. This is the best in slot that you can get for recoil out of all of the guns, and I'm showcasing the three that we just looked at with the L43A1. Here's the first three that we saw already. The DDM4, the M16, the M4A1, and finally we're going to try the L40. Again, I will leave the conclusions up to you, but my impression of this is that you're probably still just better off using the M16. The deviation is to the left this time, so it is different to the three other weapons, but it does pull pretty strongly, and I think I'd rather have the horizontal profile from the M16 so I can kind of just pull down, rather than having to worry about the left slanting nature of the recoil on this particular firearm. There is actually one more alternative for 5.56, and that is the AK-19. This is chambered in 5.56, and if you put all the mods on it, we can compare it to the M16. So you may notice here that the vertical recoil overall is very slightly better than the comparisons that we have between the M4, the DDM4, and the M16, which is interesting, although you do pay for that a little bit with RPM. So it's kind of up to you as to whether you want slightly more controllable vertical recoil on the AK-19, or whether you want higher RPM that you get with the other regular 5.56 guns. But I would say that the pattern on this one is also pretty good. It doesn't deviate that much from the center. That means that you can mostly just pull down without having to worry about the left and right too much. It's almost an inverse of the M16 actually. So given we're talking about AKs, let's look at the next set. So this is the 5.45 AKs. We have the AK-12, the AK-74M, the AK-74N, and the AKS-74U. These are all very slightly different in terms of parts, except for the M and the N, which are very, very similar. So we're going to add on things to make them as close as we can. So we've got the Ratnik grip, the stock adapter, and the PT3. I'm going to slap these on all of these. This one's got the RK9 pistol grip on this guy, This one's got a slightly different adapter, but they're all broadly the same. So the AK-74U is the little one, and it actually needs its own muzzle brake, otherwise it won't let you use it. And so then what we've got here, we've got a couple of different magazines, and all we've got in there is PP. So we're just going to use these as is, because all we're trying to do is compare them on the recoil pattern itself. It doesn't really matter what the recoil is. This has got 43% recoil control, this is 41, this one has 41 as well. This one probably has a little bit lower with 40, but it's all very similar. So let's just worry about the actual spray pattern itself. So let's start with the AK-12. Now I am going to have to grab a bunch of covers for these, otherwise we're not able to put on our sights, which makes it a little bit harder to compare. And we'll just buy a bunch of these sights from Gunny, just so we don't have to mess about. So let's start off with the AK-12. We're going to go to a different door here so that we can make sure that this all works, and I'm going to swap them all to full auto. Alright, so here we have our AK-12. This is going to be our first test. I'm going to shoot at the bottom like we did last time and see how it goes. Not bad. A little bit wiggly, but overall pretty okay. It's fairly stable in the center. Next one, we're going to look at the AK-S74U. This one is the shorty AK. So you can see a lot more deviation. The overall recoil actually is very similar. This difference is probably just the small amount of recoil control difference we've got between these guns. So it veers off further to the left to start with, and then pulls to the right very heavily through the rest of the spray pattern. Next, we have the AK-74N. Another kind of wild one. So this wiggles around a bit similarly to the other two, actually, and then pulls very heavily off to the right. So kind of the same as the U to begin with, and then mirrors it later on in the spray. And then finally, we're going to have the AK-74M. Not too bad, gets closer to the center than the others, but it elbows out quite significantly halfway through the recoil. So out of these four guns, I would say that the AK-12 is by far the standout winner. Final large category that we've got is the 7.62 rifles. This is the AK-15, the AKMN, the AKM, and the AKMSN. Again, we built them kind of similarly, so 43 recoil control, 41, 41, and 26. The reason for this is that the AKMSN can't take anything other than this stock. So this kind of sucks and makes the gun not very good. So probably avoid using it already just for that reason. But we'll have a look at all of them anyway and just see. So we'll start off with the AK-15. And in fact, this truck is perfect for this. So let's go and look at these again. So here we go. The AK-15 we're going to start with. And we'll target down here on this little dot there. Relatively nice pattern, not too much deviation, keeps relatively in the middle. Okay, let's move over to the AKM. Not quite as good. It's actually pretty decent for the first half of the magazine. It's very straight, but then it moves off to the left in the second half. So not so great for mag dumping, but it's actually all right for the first 15 bullets. Over to the AKMN. Now this one is wild. After the first 7 bullets or something, it starts veering wildly off to the right-hand side, which is going to be kind of annoying to control, but at least this is relatively consistent. I'd say that's probably the worst of the 3 so far. And then we have the AKMSN, which is the one with the dodgy stock. So this one should actually just sit higher than all the others anyway, but let's look at the pattern nonetheless. So a lot more vertical recoil, as we expected. It's actually not as bad because it veers left and right and back again, so it doesn't tend to just continue off in one direction. That one actually isn't a disaster, but I would still say that the AK-15 is probably the easiest because it only wiggles slightly around that middle value, and then after that it's probably the AKM because it's really straight and then it moves off to the left in the second half of the magazine. So as long as you know that, then you can kind of compensate for it. There's only one change you have to make in the spray pattern. Now I do find it a bit weird that guns like the AKMSN and the AKMN have got different spray pattern because these weapons are fundamentally the same gun pretty much. There's nothing about the mechanism that's any different other than the way that the stock fits onto the gun. So I do find it a bit strange that Madfigure have decided to change the recoil profiles of all the different weapons to be different to each other, and we'll see that most obviously next with the MP7. So as per usual, Banshee sells the MP7A1 and the MP7A2. These are fundamentally the same gun. The MP7A1 has a integrated vertical foregrip, whereas the MP7A2 has a vertical foregrip that you can attach on separately. So we're going to buy one of each of these guns. I might even just buy two of these to make our life slightly easier, because the money doesn't matter in this particular mode. And what we'll do is we'll unload this, and we'll take the magazine from the MP7A2, we'll stick it straight into the MP7A1 along with the Acro. So these guns are basically the same weapon at this point, MP7A1 and MP7A2 with a 40 rounder. Now we'll go back to our truck again, because there's a lot of bullets in this particular magazine, so we can compare and contrast between the two. And let's start with the MP7A1. Again, we'll start right from down here at the bottom and see how it goes. Pretty consistent pull to the right-hand side, so controllable and straightens out a little bit at the end. Let's have a look at the MP7A2. So this one goes to the left. Now we do have to remember the recoil control is going to be slightly different between these two guns, because this one can apply vertical foregrip and this one cannot. As you can see, the recoil control here is 2, and on this one it is 18. And so that's why you see a slight difference in the vertical height of the spray pattern. But the MP7A2 is more controllable on the horizontal. It moves the opposite direction, so to the left, but it's probably half as much as the MP7A1, and it's probably more consistent overall. Let's just compare this to an MP5 while we're at it. Let's find the one with the highest recoil control just on the trader, which is this one, I believe. So we'll just give this one a try, and we'll see how that compares to the MP7, just so we can see. I do think Greyzone is lacking a little bit in the SMG category. There aren't that many in this game, unfortunately. It's really the MP7 or the MP5. But let's just see what we think about this one. Honestly, not too bad. Remember that we're using a 30 rounder here. This is the 30 round magazine for the MP5, and so don't worry so much about the vertical height, because there's another 10 rounds missing from this, so it's probably about the same as the MP7A1 actually. A2 looks to be a little bit better, but it's pretty vertical. It does jink out to the left a little bit near the beginning, which is kind of unfortunate, but other than that, it's fairly straight. So the MP5 is relatively easy to use. There's a few various guns that we haven't actually managed to check out yet. There's the SIG MCX, for example. So let's go and grab this. We may as well do it while we're here. Let's go back to this. So this vertical recoil is 47%. So this is pretty much top tier meta. We'll take the scope off because it makes it kind of hard to compare the recoil patterns and how it feels if you're not using the same optic. So we will get rid of this. And we will also change the magazine over to be more similar to the other ones as well. We'll use the M16 as a good comparison. This is the one from earlier that we thought was probably the best overall. And we'll load a couple of rounds of Blackout AP into this particular gun. And into this one, we will add 855A1. So that we're talking about similar cartridges from similar weapons. So here's the MCX. Does veer off a bit. It's not too bad, but it's not too great either. Let's just remind ourselves with the good old M16, which I would say is still probably more controllable and less veering off. It moves up like this and then down like that. MCX kind of wiggles around all over the place. We haven't looked at the SA VZ58. This is comparable to the AKM style weapons, so we'll go back over there and have a look at this one. I would say that is pretty unruly. It does move up and then to the left. The first couple of bullets are pretty straight actually, but then after that it becomes kind of annoying. This is a 30.1% recoil control, so relatively good. Not the best, but relatively good. Another thing, the only other gun that we've not really tried so far is probably the AK-308, so maybe we'll just give that a shot just to see what it's like. And at that point, I think we can probably call it a day. So let's just remove the scope from this guy, we'll pop the EXP3 on here, we'll just see what this looks like. I mean, the vertical recoil on this should be pretty hefty. This thing is a 20 round magazine, but let's see what the pattern looks like. Okay, so it veers off to the right quite significantly right from the beginning, which makes it pretty hard to control, I would say, and then moves back around again, so not great. But, you know, it fires 308 on full auto, so we can't really complain too much. So in conclusion, the best 5.56 weapon for weapon spray pattern is the M16 if you want to be using an 800 RPM gun, or the AK-19 if you don't mind 700 RPM and want slightly lower vertical recoil. Within 5.45, the standout performer was the AK-12, but the second was probably the AK-74M. If you don't have access to an AK-12, you don't have one to hand. Within 7.62, the AK-15 was pretty good, fairly straight, and second, I would say the AKM. And finally, in the SMGs category, the MP5 was by far the straightest in terms of recoil pattern. However, if you want higher RPM, then the MP7A2 is significantly better than the MP7A1 in terms of controllability. So with that, let me just mention that the Twitch Drops campaign is coming to a close on Friday. If you want to go and get the Gigabeef patch for your outfit that stays between wipes, then you have to come over and watch 2 hours of my stream. That is going to be ending very, very soon after the release of this video. So I'll be doing 2 more streams, one in my evening, UK time, and one tomorrow up until the deadline for those of you who want to grab it at the last minute. Otherwise, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.